The stagecoach wheezed to a stop like an old man settling into his deathbed, and perhaps that was fitting, considering where it had brought him. October 3rd, 1894, and the piano tuner found himself standing in what might generously be called the main street of Perdition's Rest, Nevada. The dust hadn't even settled from the coach's arrival before it was already preparing to leave, the driver eager to be away from this particular corner of nowhere. He stood there, tool case in one hand, traveling bag in the other, taking in the peculiar arithmetic of abandonment. You see, dying towns have their own mathematics. For every occupied building, 3 stood empty, their windows staring like cataracts. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the whole scene the color of old bones. 47 souls, he'd been told, still called this place home, down from 3,000 during the silver boom. That's what panic does to a place built on optimism and ore. The tuner was 47 himself, though he wore those years better than the town wore its dozen. His hands, marked by countless encounters with piano wire and tuning hammers, picked up his bags with practiced efficiency. A German accent still colored his thoughts, though 24 years in America had worn it thin in his speech. Where does one go, he wondered, when the somewhere becomes nowhere? The boarding house materialized first, as boarding houses do in such places, necessary, prominent, and slightly embarrassed about both facts. The sign read, "Torres Boarding House," in faded blue paint, and beneath it, a woman stood sweeping dust from dust, that particular futile gesture of civilization refusing to surrender. She was Mexican, 35 perhaps, with the kind of face that had seen enough to stop being surprised, but not enough to stop being kind. "You'd be the piano man," she said, not a question. In a town of 47, everyone knew who was coming before they arrived. "I tune pianos, yes." "Well, you've come to the right place for things being out of tune." She leaned on her broom. "I'm Magdalena Torres. Maggie, if you're staying more than a day. Which you will be. That piano of Sam's has been scaring away what little custom he has left." The tuner set down his cases. This was always the delicate moment, negotiating lodging in a place where every dollar mattered and everyone pretended it didn't. "The haunted piano," he said carefully. "Mr. Harwick mentioned it in his letter." Maggie snorted. "Haunted? Sam Harwick wouldn't know a real ghost if it asked him for credit at the bar." But then she paused, and something flickered across her face. "Though I'll grant you, that piano does play at night. 2 in the morning, regular as clockwork. Same sad tune every time." Inside the boarding house, time had slowed to a crawl sometime around 1885, and hadn't bothered to catch up. Antimacassars on every chair, daguerreotypes watching from the walls, the smell of lavender fighting a losing battle against desert dust. The tuner found himself thinking of Philadelphia, where he'd learned his trade, where pianos stood in parlors that never questioned their own existence. His room was small but clean, overlooking the main street. From the window he could see Sam's saloon, a 2-story affair that was trying too hard to look prosperous. The painted sign showed a hand of cards and a whiskey bottle, universal symbols of hope and forgetting. Somewhere in there sat a piano that played itself in the dead of night, mourning a gambler named Chester Doyle who'd bled out over a card table 2 years back. The tuner unpacked methodically. "His tuning forks, A440, the standard, though out here standards were more like suggestions. His leather roll of tools, each in its designated pocket. The small photograph of Elizabeth, dead these 5 years from consumption, which he placed face down in the drawer. Some ghosts, he'd learned, you carried with you whether you wanted to or not. By evening, he'd made the acquaintance of Judge Cornelius Blackwood, though acquaintance might be too formal a word for watching a man stumble from the saloon to his rooms above the abandoned bank. 64 years old, white-bearded, with the kind of dignity that alcohol hadn't quite managed to drown. "You're here about that damned piano," the judge had muttered as they passed on the street. "Some things are better left untuned, if you take my meaning." The tuner didn't, but he nodded anyway. Judges, even retired ones, even drunk ones, had a way of making pronouncements that sounded profound even when they weren't. At dinner, Maggie served beans and cornbread to her 3 boarders: the tuner, a traveling supplies salesman who'd leave in the morning, and a silent man who worked at the last functioning mine shaft 2 miles out. The conversation was sparse, punctuated by the sound of forks on plates and wind starting its evening performance through the gaps in the walls. "That wind," Maggie said suddenly, "it knows things, knows where every crack and crevice is. Some nights it sounds like the whole town is moaning." The salesman laughed nervously. The miner continued eating. The tuner listened to the wind's pitch, somewhere between F and F sharp, he noted automatically. Everything had a frequency, a resonance, even dying towns, even ghost stories. Later, standing on the boarding house porch, he could see the saloon's windows glowing amber with lamplight. Tomorrow he'd meet this piano, this instrument that had taken on a life of its own in the collective imagination of Perdition's Rest. He wondered, not for the first time, why he kept taking these jobs in forgotten places. The money wasn't much better than in the cities. Perhaps it was the simplicity of it. One piano, one problem, one solution. Not like life, which insisted on being complicated, whether you asked it to or not. A figure darted between buildings, small, quick, juvenile. The boy disappeared before the tuner could properly see him, but there was something furtive about the movement, something that suggested secret purposes. Well, everyone had secrets here. In a town this small, secrets were probably the only private property left worth having. The stars emerged with desert clarity, and the tuner found himself thinking about resonance, about how a string vibrates not just at its fundamental frequency, but in harmonics, creating overtones that the ear might not consciously hear, but the soul somehow recognized. Perhaps that's what ghost stories were, the overtones of history, vibrating just outside the range of normal perception, felt more than heard. Tomorrow he would begin. Tonight he would sleep in a bed that sagged with other people's dreams and listen to a town dying so slowly it had forgotten it wasn't already dead. Somewhere in the darkness a piano waited, holding its secret close, ready to sing its mournful song when the clock struck 2. Sam Harwick had the kind of face that suggested life had thrown its worst at him and he'd caught most of it with his jaw. 52 years old, built like a man who'd wrestled ore from the earth before wrestling drinks across a bar, he stood behind his counter polishing a glass that hadn't seen actual whiskey in months. The morning of October 4th brought the tuner to Sam's saloon, where optimism went to drown but couldn't afford the drinks. "There she is," Sam said, gesturing with his polishing cloth toward the far corner. The way he said "she" carried a weight of familiarity and fear that men usually reserve for difficult wives or unpredictable horses. The piano stood against the north wall, and the tuner had to admit it was a beauty even in its neglect. An 1871 Steinway square grand, rosewood case gone dull with dust but structurally sound. These instruments had been built to survive frontier life, to be hauled by wagon across territories that didn't yet deserve the name. This one had outlived its purpose, like everything else in Perdition's Rest. "Tell me about Chester Doyle," the tuner said, running his fingers along the keyboard without pressing the keys, feeling for loose action, sensing the instrument's readiness to speak. Sam set down his glass with excessive care. His left hand, the tuner noticed, was missing the ring and little fingers. Old mining accident, probably, the kind of tithe the earth extracted from those who tried to rob her. October 28th, 92. 2 years ago this month. He was winning, which should have been the first warning. Chester never won that big. Not honest, anyway. The tuner opened his tool case, laying out his implements with surgical precision. Who was he playing against? 3 miners from the Copper Queen outfit. They said he was cheating. He said they were sore losers. Someone pulled a knife. Sam's voice went flat, the way voices do when they're describing something they'd rather forget. Bled out right there. About where you're standing, actually. We dragged him out back. Judge Blackwood pronounced him dead, and that was that. Only it wasn't. The tuner pressed middle C. The note rang true enough, though with a metallic aftertaste that suggested the soundboard needed attention. When did the piano start playing on its own? 3 nights later, 2 in the morning, exact time Chester died. Always the same tune, Barbara Allen, slow and mournful-like. First time it happened, I was sleeping upstairs. Came down with my shotgun, thinking someone broke in. Nobody here. Just that piano. Silent as death, but with the sustain pedal still trembling. Judge Blackwood entered then, his morning drunk already begun, wearing yesterday's clothes with today's regrets. The tuner noticed how the judge avoided looking at the piano directly, the way guilty men avoid meeting eyes. "Mr. Harwick, the usual," he said, though his attention fixed on the tuner. "You know, young man, some mysteries are better left mysterious. They give a place character." "Character doesn't pay bills," Sam muttered, pouring the judge a whiskey that looked more like water than anything else. The tuner continued his examination. E-flat, B-flat. Both keys produced an unusual resonance, a sympathetic vibration that seemed to come from beneath the instrument itself. He knelt, peering under the piano. The floorboards were older than the rest of the saloon's floor, probably original construction. Between 2 boards, a gap no wider than a finger showed darkness beneath. "What's under this room?" he asked. Sam and the judge exchanged glances. "Nothing," Sam said too quickly. "Just crawl space. Maybe some old mine workings from the early days, but they're all sealed up." The tuner made a non-committal sound. In his experience, nothing was often something people hoped would stay nothing. He returned to the keys, playing a simple scale. The piano was out of tune, certainly, but not catastrophically so. It had been maintained until recently, probably by Chester himself. Gamblers often had hidden talents, skills they'd acquired in other lives before cards became their religion. "Mr. Doyle played this piano?" "Every night before the games," Sam confirmed. "Said it brought him luck. Fat lot of good it did him in the end." A boy appeared in the doorway, 14 perhaps, rail-thin with the kind of hunger that wasn't just about food. His clothes suggested stable work. His eyes suggested intelligence, trying not to be noticed. This would be Theodore, the tuner realized, the quick shadow from last night. "Mr. Harwick, sir, I've finished with the horses," the boy said. though there couldn't have been more than 3 horses in the whole town worth tending. "That's Teddy," Sam explained. "He helps out. Parents died in the cholera outbreak of '91. Good boy. Quiet." The boy's eyes had locked onto the piano with an expression the tuner recognized. It was the look of someone who heard music as a language when words failed them. "Do you play?" the tuner asked him. Teddy shook his head quickly, but his fingers twitched in tiny patterns. Someone had been practicing scales in secret, probably on this very instrument when the saloon was empty. "The boy's got no musical education," Sam said firmly, a warning in his tone that suggested this topic was closed. The judge drained his glass and stood unsteadily. "I'll leave you to your work, but remember, Piano Man, this town needs its ghost. It's the only interesting thing about us anymore. Sometimes a lie that keeps people going is worth more than a truth that doesn't." After the judge departed, weaving slightly, Sam leaned closer to the tuner. "You should know something. 2 weeks ago, some Eastern investors came through, looking for opportunities, they said. Ghost towns they could buy cheap and turn into tourist attractions. They heard about our haunted piano. If I could prove it's real, genuinely supernatural..." He trailed off, but the desperation in his voice finished the sentence. The tuner played E-flat and B-flat together. The resonance was stronger this time, as if something below was answering. "You want me to tune it or not tune it? I want you to make it convincing," Sam said quietly. "Whatever's causing it, whether it's Chester's ghost or something else, I need it to keep happening. This town is dying, Mr. Piano Man." "That saloon in Virginia City that claims to have a ghost? They're doing good business. People come from San Francisco just to see it." The tuner nodded slowly. He'd been hired to solve a mystery. But the real mystery wasn't what made the piano play. It was how to save a town that had already accepted its death certificate. He thought of Maggie, sweeping dust from dust, of the judge drowning his guilt in watered whiskey, of young Teddy with his secret musical ambitions and nowhere to pursue them. "I'll need to stay tonight," he said, "to observe the phenomenon." Sam's relief was palpable. "You can sleep on the couch in the back room. I'll pay extra." "No need. Professional curiosity." As the tuner packed his tools, he noticed Teddy still hovering in the doorway. The boy's fingers continued their silent practice, playing an invisible keyboard only he could see. There were ghosts in this town, certainly, but perhaps the most poignant were the living ones. The people haunting their own lives, waiting for something, anything to change the tune. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the saloon's dusty floor, the tuner sat at the piano and played, not Barbara Allen, but Bach's Invention No. 8 in F major, a piece his wife Elizabeth had loved. The notes filled the empty space with temporary beauty, and for a moment, Perdition's Rest didn't seem quite so lost. Even ghosts, he thought, deserved good music. The saloon after midnight became a different creature entirely, the tuner discovered. Without the pretense of customers, it could finally admit what it was: a mausoleum for better times, where bottles stood like headstones, and the mirror behind the bar reflected nothing but its own loneliness. He sat in the darkness, having extinguished all but one lamp turned low, listening to the building settle into itself with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like conversation. 1:45 in the morning. October 4th had surrendered to the 5th without ceremony. The tuner had positioned himself where he could see both the piano and the door, though Sam had locked the latter with elaborate care before retiring upstairs. The couch in the back room had been offered, but the tuner preferred to keep watch from the main floor, where the mystery lived. His pocket watch, a Hamburg piece that had crossed the Atlantic with him, ticked toward 2 o'clock with German precision. The piano stood silent, its keys catching what little light remained, like teeth in a skull's grin. He found himself thinking about Chester Doyle, bleeding out on these very floorboards. What kind of man inspired a ghost story? Gamblers were rarely mourned, especially cheating ones. A scratch at the door made him tense. Then another. Not a knock, but something more furtive, like an animal pawing for entry. The tuner rose quietly, approaching the door on feet trained by years of trying not to disturb sleeping boarding houses. Through the window, a shadow moved. Human, small, young. He eased the door open to find Teddy, the stable boy, frozen mid-scratch like a cat caught at the cream. I was just, the boy stammered. You were just coming to hear the ghost, the tuner said, stepping aside. Better to have a witness anyway, and the boy's presence felt more honest than the adult deceptions swirling around this place. Teddy slipped inside, moving with practiced stealth toward the storage room behind the bar. I sleep here sometimes, he admitted. When the boarding house is full, or when... He trailed off, but the tuner understood. When loneliness became too heavy, when being an orphan in a dying town pressed down like the weight of all that earth above the mine shafts. You've heard it before? The piano? The boy nodded, settling into a corner where wooden crates created a natural shelter. 23 times. I keep count. Always the same. Always Barbara Allen. My mother used to sing it, before the cholera. 1:58. The tuner returned to his position, noting how Teddy had made himself nearly invisible in the shadows, a useful skill for a boy nobody wanted to notice. Tell me about Chester Doyle, he said quietly. He was teaching me, Teddy whispered, then caught himself. He let me watch sometimes when he played. He said I had good hands for it. Said music was just mathematics you could hear. This was new information, carefully omitted from Sam's version of events. Sam didn't know? Mr. Harwick don't like me touching the piano. Says it's too valuable for orphan fingers. But Mr. Doyle, he said music belonged to everybody, even stable boys. 2 o'clock. The first note came like a drop of water in a dry cave, E-flat, sustained longer than any human finger would hold it, then B-flat, joining its companion in a harmony that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. The tuner felt the hair on his arms rise, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't random. This was purposeful. The melody began properly then. Barbara Allen indeed, but played with a hesitation, a stumbling quality that suggested unfamiliarity rather than supernatural smoothness. The tuner watched the keys depress and rise without any visible force, creating music that was both there and not there, like moonlight on water. Teddy had gone rigid in his corner, but not with fear. His fingers moved in the air, following along with the ghostly performance. He knew this arrangement, had probably watched Chester play it dozens of times. The song continued for exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds. The tuner timed it, before ending on an unresolved chord that hung in the air like a question nobody wanted to answer. Then silence, so complete it felt like deafness. There, Teddy breathed. Did you see? The tuner had seen, but more importantly, he'd heard. The resonance from those two keys, E-flat and B-flat, had been stronger during the performance, as if something beneath the floor was participating in the music. He approached the piano, kneeling again to peer through the gap in the floorboards. A draft touched his face, carrying the smell of deep earth and something else. Smoke? Food? "Teddy," he said carefully, "has anyone else been in the old mine shafts lately?" The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Nobody goes down there. Mr. Harwick says they're dangerous, could collapse any time." But there was something in his voice. That particular note children strike when they're telling a technical truth to avoid a larger lie. The tuner had heard it countless times from his young students in Philadelphia, explaining why they hadn't practiced their scales. "You've seen someone," he said, not a question. Teddy was quiet for a long moment. Then, barely audible, "Sometimes there's lights, way back in the hills where the old entrance used to be, like lantern light, but moving around. And sometimes food goes missing from Maggie's kitchen. She blames rats, but rats don't take whole loaves of bread and leave payment." "Payment?" "Little things. Carved wooden animals, mostly. She keeps them, but doesn't talk about it." The tuner sat back on his heels, pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind like piano hammers finding their strings. A ghost that played hesitant music. Missing food replaced with carved tokens. Mine shafts that should be empty but showed signs of life. And everyone, Sam, Maggie, even young Teddy, protecting their portion of the secret while pretending not to know the whole. "Mr. Piano Man," Teddy said suddenly, using Sam's dismissive term, but without the dismissiveness. "Are you going to make it stop?" The tuner looked at the boy, 14 years old, with nowhere to go and nothing to hope for except the occasional secret piano lesson from a dead gambler. "What do you think I should do?" "I think," Teddy paused, choosing words with care, "I think sometimes things need to be broken before they can be fixed proper. Like a piano string that's been tuned wrong so long it won't hold the right pitch anymore. You have to let it go slack, let it rest, then bring it back up slow." Philosophy from a stable boy. But then, the tuner reflected, wisdom didn't require education, just observation. And this boy had been observing everything from his invisible corner for years. "Show me," the tuner said, gesturing to the piano bench. "Show me what Chester taught you." Teddy's eyes widened. "Mr. Harwick would—" "Mr. Harwick is asleep, and I'm the expert he hired. I say you can play." The boy approached the piano like a pilgrim approaching a shrine, reverent and afraid in equal measure. He sat, adjusted the bench with practiced movement, and placed his hands on the keys with a delicacy that suggested he'd been practicing on flat surfaces, imagining the weight and resistance of real keys. He played a simple melody, not Barbara Allen, but something else, something that sounded like hope, transcribed into notes. His technique was raw, but his feeling was pure, and the tuner heard in it the echo of Chester Doyle's instruction, a gambler's last gift to a boy everyone else ignored. "He wasn't a bad man," Teddy said when he finished. "He just made bad choices." "There's a difference, isn't there?" The tuner thought of his own choices, of Elizabeth dying in Philadelphia while he tuned pianos for people who would never appreciate them, of all the small compromises that led to large regrets. "Yes," he said, "there's a difference." Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere beneath their feet the earth hummed its ancient frequencies, waiting for someone to finally hear the truth it had been singing all along. Morning of October 6th arrived with unusual clouds, gray-bellied and swollen with rain that would probably never fall. The tuner had spent the previous day in careful observation, mapping the saloon's architecture in his mind while pretending to simply maintain the piano. Now he stood in the basement entrance, a trap door behind the bar that Sam had reluctantly revealed after extensive persuasion. "Nobody's been down there in years," Sam insisted, holding a lantern that trembled slightly in his grip. The missing fingers on his left hand, the tuner noticed, twitched, as if trying to grasp something that wasn't there. The foundations are from the original 1868 building. Everything else burned in the fire of '73, but the basement survived. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, each creak a small protest against this investigation. The tuner descended carefully, noting how the air grew cooler and carried that distinctive smell of deep places, minerals and moisture and time compressed into an almost tangible presence. Sam followed reluctantly, his breathing loud in the confined space. The basement was larger than expected, stretching beyond the saloon's footprint. Stone walls, properly mortared, suggested professional construction from the town's optimistic early days. The ceiling, reinforced with heavy beams, showed where the piano sat directly above. And there, exactly where the tuner had calculated, was an opening in the floor, a shaft, perhaps 3 feet across, edges worn smooth by long-vanished machinery. "Ventilation shaft," Sam said quickly. "From when this was connected to the mine system. It's sealed further down, has been for 20 years." The tuner knelt beside the shaft, lowering the lantern carefully. The light descended perhaps 10 feet before the shaft curved, following some logic of mineral veins or easier digging. But what interested him most was the fresh disturbance in the dust around the opening and the worn rope tied to a ceiling beam, its end disappearing into darkness. "Someone's been using this," he said simply. Sam's face went through several expressions before settling on defensive anger. "That's impossible. I would know if someone was—" "Mr. Harwick?" The voice came from above, and both men looked up to see Judge Blackwood's face peering through the trap door. Even from below, the tuner could smell the whiskey fumes. "I believe you have customers requiring attention." It was barely 9 in the morning. The saloon shouldn't even be open yet, but Sam seized the excuse, climbing the stairs with sudden urgency. "We'll continue this later," he muttered, though his tone suggested they wouldn't. The judge descended as Sam ascended, passing on the narrow stairs with careful maneuvering. Once alone with the tuner in the basement, the older man's demeanor shifted, becoming sharper despite the alcohol. "You're stirring up things better left settled, young man." "I was hired to investigate the piano phenomenon." "You were hired to validate a ghost story that keeps this town marginally interesting to outside investors." The judge sat heavily on a wooden crate, his dignity maintaining itself despite everything trying to erode it. "Do you know what happens to towns when they lose their last interesting feature? They don't just die, they disappear." Maps get redrawn without them. The railroad companies use their buildings for timber. The desert takes back everything, as if hundreds of people never lived and loved and died here. The tuner studied the judge's face, seeing in it the kind of truth that only emerged when alcohol dissolved careful facades. "You know what's really happening here." "I know many things. I know Chester Doyle owed money to the kind of men who collect in blood. I know he couldn't have won that much at cards without cheating. I know the knife that killed him was his own, pulled in self-defense during a struggle he initiated. The judge pulled out a flask, considered it, then put it away unopened. I also know that sometimes the dead serve the living better than they ever did while breathing. Above them, footsteps crossed the saloon floor, multiple sets moving with purpose.
The tuner heard Sam's voice, artificially cheerful, and others responding, Eastern accents, cultured tones that stood out in Perdition's Rest like silk in a sawmill. The investors, the judge explained, arrived this morning. 2 gentlemen from Boston who think the West is a commodity to be packaged and sold to bored city dwellers. They want to see our famous haunted piano. The tuner looked again at the ventilation shaft, at the rope, at the disturbed dust that told of regular passage. And if they discover it's not really haunted, then we become another footnote in the great book of failed towns that nobody will ever write because nobody cares enough to remember. The judge stood, steadying himself against the wall. Chester was a mediocre gambler but an excellent piano player. Did you know that? Could have played professionally if he hadn't preferred cards to concert halls. The boy Teddy mentioned Chester was teaching him. Something softened in the judge's expression. One of Chester's few kindnesses. The boy has talents, but no future. Rather like the town itself. They climbed back up to find the saloon transformed by the presence of strangers. 2 men in city suits stood examining the piano, while Sam hovered nervously nearby. They had that particular combination of wealth and skepticism that made everyone around them feel shabby and fraudulent. Mr. Worthington and Mr. Crane, Sam introduced them, from the Boston Historical Preservation Society. The tuner doubted that was the real name of their organization, but he nodded politely. Worthington, the older of the 2, had sharp eyes that missed nothing. Crane carried a notebook and pencil, ready to document whatever they deemed worth documenting. "You're the piano expert," Worthington said. "Tell us about this instrument's peculiarities." The tuner chose his words carefully. "It exhibits unusual resonance patterns, particularly in certain keys."
The acoustic properties of the building, combined with environmental factors, create conditions that could be interpreted as paranormal activity. "Could be interpreted," Crane repeated, writing it down. "But you're not convinced." "I'm investigating all possibilities." Worthington walked slowly around the piano, examining it from every angle. "We're prepared to invest significantly in authentic Western supernatural sites. The market for such experiences is growing, but we require genuine phenomena, not carnival tricks." Sam's desperation was almost palpable. "Stay tonight. You'll hear it yourself. 2 in the morning, regular as clockwork." "We intend to." Worthington's smile was thin. "We've taken rooms at Mrs. Torres's establishment. Tonight should be illuminating." After they left, the saloon felt smaller somehow, as if their presence had emphasized how much empty space surrounded everything. Sam slumped against the bar, and the tuner noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "If they don't believe," Sam started, then stopped. What was there to say? They all knew what would happen if the investors walked away. The tuner returned to the piano, running his fingers over the keys without playing. Somewhere beneath his feet, that shaft led to mysteries he was beginning to understand. The rope worn smooth by regular use, the disturbed dust. Teddy's mentions of lights in the old mine entrances. carved wooden animals left as payment for stolen food. Chester Doyle had bled out on this floor 2 years ago. But perhaps, the tuner thought, there were different kinds of death and different kinds of resurrection. Perhaps a man could die in one story and live in another, especially in a town that needed its ghosts more than it needed truth. He thought of Elizabeth, truly dead and truly gone, and how no amount of wishing had ever brought her music back. But here in Perdition's Rest, death seemed negotiable, a matter of perspective and necessity rather than absolute fact. Tonight, the investors would come to judge the ghost, and the tuner would have to decide whether his job was to reveal the truth or to protect it, to tune the piano or to preserve its mysterious song. October 7th brought the kind of wind that made people reconsider their life choices, particularly the choice to live in a desert town held together by hope and habit. The tuner stood at the window of his boarding house room, watching dust devils dance down the main street like drunken spirits, and considered what he'd discovered the night before. The investors had witnessed the 2 o'clock performance, standing in the saloon with the kind of rigid attention usually reserved for opera houses. The piano had played its ghostly tune, keys depressing with invisible fingers, and Worthington had actually smiled, an expression that transformed his face from skeptical to avaricious.
They'd left without comment, but their eyes had held the gleam of men who'd found gold in what others called pyrite. Now, in the harsh morning light, the tuner made his way to the abandoned mine entrance 2 miles from town. He'd told Maggie he was taking a constitutional walk, which earned him a look that suggested she knew better but wouldn't challenge the lie. Everyone here, it seemed, had agreed to a collective fiction that required individual performances. The desert between town and mine was littered with the archaeology of optimism. Rusted equipment, collapsed shanties, the bones of dreams picked clean by 20 years of weather. The mine entrance itself was supposedly sealed, but the tuner had learned that sealed in Perdition's Rest meant officially discouraged. The boards across the opening had been recently disturbed, nails pulled and carefully replaced. He entered cautiously, aware that abandoned mines had their own ways of killing the curious. Bad air, unstable timbers, shafts that opened beneath unwary feet like mouths. But this entrance showed signs of regular passage, the dust disturbed in a clear path, fresh scratches on the support beams where someone had steadied themselves. 20 feet in, he found the first carved animal. It sat on a natural shelf in the rock, a small wooden horse so detailed he could see individual strands in its mane. The kind of patient work that suggested long hours with nothing but time and pine and memory. There were others further in, a dog, an eagle, a bear standing on hind legs, each one perfectly carved, each one dusty except where fingers had recently touched them. "You shouldn't be here." The voice came from deeper in the tunnel, rough from disuse but unmistakably human. The tuner didn't startle. He'd been expecting this, hoping for it even. "Neither should you, Mr. Doyle." A long silence, then the scrape of boots on stone. Chester Doyle emerged from the darkness like something the earth had coughed up, bearded and filthy but very much alive. 41 years old, according to the records, but looking older now, carved down by 2 years of underground existence into something essential and desperate. "How did you know?" The piano plays hesitantly, like someone remembering a song through walls and distance. The food that goes missing but leaves payment, the rope in the ventilation shaft worn smooth by your hands.
And young Teddy, who keeps your secret because you were the only adult who ever showed him kindness." Chester laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "The boy figured it out first. Caught me taking bread from Maggie's kitchen 6 months after I died. Smart kid, loyal too." They stood there in the mine entrance, two men caught between darkness and light, between truth and necessity.
Chester's hands, the tuner noticed, still had the long fingers of a piano player, though now they were covered in the calluses of survival. "Why?" the tuner asked, though he suspected he knew. "I owed money to the Garrison brothers, the kind of debt that compounds in blood. That night at the card table, I was winning for once, really winning, not even cheating. But Tom Garrison couldn't let that stand. When he pulled the knife, claimed I was cheating, I knew how it would end. Sam saw it too. So Sam helped you. Slipped me something to slow my heart, make me seem dead. Judge Blackwood was drunk enough to pronounce me deceased without checking too careful. They buried an empty coffin while I crawled into these mines like the ghost I was supposed to be." The tuner thought about Sam's desperation, his missing fingers, his trembling hands. "And the piano?" Chester's expression shifted, becoming something almost tender. "I miss it. God, I miss playing. Sometimes at night, I climb up through that shaft just to be near it. I can feel the strings' vibration through the floor when the wind hits just right. E-flat and B-flat. They resonate with the wind in these tunnels, creates a sympathetic vibration that makes the keys move." "You discovered this by accident?" "First time scared me worse than dying. But then Sam realized what was happening. Started timing his stories to match, building the legend. And when I heard about the investors," Chester spread his hands, "a ghost might save this town. A living debtor would just be another failure." The tuner walked to the mine entrance, looking back toward town. From here, Perdition's Rest looked like what it was, a collection of buildings slowly losing their argument with entropy. The investors were impressed. They'll likely make an offer. And then? Then, you remain dead, Mr. Doyle. The ghost of the gambler who plays piano becomes part of the attraction. Tourist dollars flow to see the supernatural West. The town survives a bit longer. Chester carved another stroke into the piece of wood he'd been holding. Another horse, or perhaps a memory of one. "You know what's funny? I'm better at being dead than I ever was at being alive. As a ghost, I'm actually helping people. As a man, all I did was take." That evening back in town, the tuner made adjustments to the piano. Not tuning exactly, but enhancing certain properties. He modified the felt on the hammers of E-flat and B-flat, making them more responsive to vibration. He adjusted the dampers to allow those strings to ring longer. When the wind came through the shaft below at the right angle and speed, the effect would be even more pronounced. Teddy watched from his corner, understanding without being told that the tuner was helping the illusion rather than exposing it. "Will it sound better now?" "It will sound more intentional. More like someone playing from memory and longing rather than mere wind and physics." Maggie appeared in the doorway with coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute most folks had settled for. She set it down without comment, but her eyes met the tuner's with an understanding that said she knew exactly what kind of tune he was playing. "The investors are talking about bringing photographers," she said. "Magazine writers. They want to document the ghost town with its genuine phantom pianist." The tuner sipped the coffee.
tasting in it the same bitterness that colored everything in Perdition's Rest. The flavor of compromises made for survival. Then they'll need a good story, something romantic, tragic. The gambler who loved music more than cards, who returns to play for his sins. Is that what Chester was? Romantic and tragic? That's what he needs to be now. As night fell, the tuner continued his modifications while the wind outside began its evening performance.
Soon it would find the mine shafts, would sing through the tunnels and up through the ventilation shaft, would make two strings vibrate in harmony with the desert's own frequency. And somewhere in the darkness, Chester Doyle would sit in his underground exile, carving wooden animals and listening to his own ghost story being born. The morning of October 9th arrived with rain. Actual rain, not just the promise of it, falling in fat drops that turned the dust to mud and made everyone in Perdition's Rest stand outside like they'd forgotten what water from the sky felt like. The tuner watched from the saloon window as Maggie held her hands out, palms up, catching drops with the reverence usually reserved for communion wine. But rain in the desert had consequences. By afternoon, he and Teddy were standing at the mine entrance, watching brown water pour from the tunnels like the earth was purging itself of secrets. Chester's sanctuary was flooding, and with it, any pretense that the mines were truly abandoned. "He'll drown if he stays down there," Teddy said, his young voice tight with worry. The tuner had already reached the same conclusion. Together they ventured into the mine, sloshing through ankle-deep water that grew deeper with each step. They found Chester in his makeshift living space, a natural chamber about 300 feet in, furnished with salvaged items that told the story of 2 years' desperate domesticity. He was frantically trying to save his carved animals, cradling them like children as water rose around his knees. "Leave them," the tuner ordered. "Your life is worth more than wood." "These are all I've made of my time here," Chester protested, but he allowed himself to be led out, clutching just 3 carvings: the first horse, a woman's face, and oddly, a piano no bigger than his thumb. They emerged to find Judge Blackwood waiting, sober for once, his face grave as cemetery soil. "So," he said simply, "the dead walk." Chester stood there dripping, looking more like a drowned rat than a resurrection, while the judge studied him with those eyes that had seen too much law bent and too much justice avoided. The moment stretched until the tuner thought it might snap. "I see a stranger," the judge finally said. "A drifter who bears an unfortunate resemblance to a man who died 2 years ago. Tragic how these desert towns attract such mysterious figures." It was absolution, delivered in legal riddles. Chester sagged with relief, and Teddy actually smiled, an expression so rare on his face it looked almost foreign. That evening, in Maggie's kitchen, while the rain continued its improbable percussion on the roof, they held counsel. Sam had been summoned, told simply that complications had arisen. He'd arrived to find Chester alive, cleaned up, and eating soup like resurrection was an appetite stimulant. "Jesus Christ," Sam had said, then sat down heavily. "Jesus Christ on a piano bench." "The investors sign papers tomorrow," Maggie said, practical as always. "They're offering enough to keep the town running for 2 years, maybe 3 if we're careful. But they want the ghost. They've already telegraphed newspapers in San Francisco about it." The tuner had been thinking about this problem since the mine flooded. "Mr. Doyle needs to leave, tonight, but the ghost can stay." "How?" Sam asked.
Without Chester, there's no... The wind will still play those keys, I've made sure of that. And young Teddy here has been practicing Chester's arrangement of Barbara Allen, haven't you? The boy nodded slowly. Understanding dawning in his eyes. I could play it, from the basement, through the shaft. If someone helped me with the timing... But that's fraud, Judge Blackwood said, though his tone suggested he was merely stating a legal fact rather than objecting. No more fraudulent than a dead man who wasn't dead, the tuner replied. The investors want a ghost story. The town needs investment. Chester needs freedom. Everyone gets what they require, if not what they deserve. Chester spoke for the first time since they'd started planning. Where would I go? California, Maggie said immediately. I have a cousin in Sacramento who runs a music hall. She's always looking for piano players. I've already written her about a talented musician who might need work. The tuner noticed how she said, already written, past tense, and understood that Maggie had been planning this ending longer than any of them. In a town full of secret keepers, she might be the master. I have $40 saved, Chester said. Hidden in the mine, probably washed away now. You have $63, Sam corrected. I've been setting aside a percentage of the ghost story profits. Figured if you were alive, you'd eventually need traveling money. If you were dead, well, it would cover a better headstone. This revelation sat among them like another presence at the table. The tuner thought about community, about how even in their deceptions, these people had been caring for each other. It was fraud, certainly, but it was fraud with heart. That night they made their preparations. Chester would leave on the midnight cargo wagon that came through twice weekly, heading west to Carson City and then to California. His death would remain official history. The ghost would continue performing, now with Teddy as the hidden musician, playing from the basement through the ventilation shaft while the wind provided the mechanical action on the keys above. It's not right, Judge Blackwood said, though he was helping Chester pack his few belongings. But then, what in this town has been right since the silver ran out? At least this lie keeps people fed. The tuner gave Chester his own traveling coat, better than anything the gambler had worn in years. You could have been a concert pianist, he said. You have the hands for it. I had the hands, Chester corrected, but not the heart. Always wanted the quick score, the easy money. Music takes patience I never had. He paused. Maybe now I'll find it. Being dead for 2 years teaches you about patience. They gathered at the back door of the saloon near midnight. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and sharp with the smell of wet sage. The cargo wagon waited. Its driver paid extra to see nothing and remember less. Chester stood there looking at the town that had been his prison and sanctuary both. Tell the boy, he said to the tuner, meaning Teddy, who was back at the boarding house maintaining plausible distance from this farewell. Tell him to practice every day. Tell him music is the only honest thing in a dishonest world. He knows, Maggie said softly. You taught him that. Chester climbed onto the wagon and within moments was swallowed by darkness, heading toward a new life that his death had made possible. The tuner stood with the others, watching until even the sound of wheels faded into nothing. Well, Judge Blackwood said, producing his flask but not drinking from it, just holding it like a talisman. We've either saved a man or damned ourselves, possibly both. Both, Sam agreed. Definitely both. They returned to their respective shelters, conspirators bound now by shared fiction. The tuner sat at the piano one more time playing a few bars of Barbara Allen, thinking about the strange mathematics of redemption. Tomorrow the investors would sign papers.
Tomorrow, the ghost would be official, documented, marketed. Tomorrow, Perdition's Rest would begin its transformation from dying town to tourist curiosity. But tonight, Chester Doyle was finally free, riding through the desert toward a city where no one knew his name or his sins. The rain had washed the dust from everything, and for a moment, just a moment, even the lies seemed clean. October 11th dawned with the kind of clarity that made the desert seem infinite, and the tuner found himself in the unusual position of teaching a dead man's ghost how to be more convincing. Teddy sat in the saloon's basement, fingers poised over a practice keyboard they'd constructed from marked planks, while above them the real piano waited for its next performance. The hesitation, the tuner explained, is what sells it. Chester always paused before the third measure, like he was remembering something painful. You need to capture that. The boy nodded, his concentration absolute. In the 2 days since Chester's departure, Teddy had transformed from stable boy to secret performer, though only the inner circle knew of his new role. The investors had signed their papers yesterday, October 10th, committing funds based on their supernatural experience. Now the ghost had to remain consistent, believable, profitable. "Mr. Piano Man," Teddy said suddenly, using the title with newfound respect, "what happens when I get older? When my hands get bigger? Won't the playing sound different?" It was a practical question from a practical boy. The tuner had been thinking about this himself. "Ghosts," he said carefully, "can evolve. Maybe the spirit grows stronger over time, plays with more confidence. The story adapts." Judge Blackwood descended the stairs, his morning drunk delayed in favor of this education. "The boy asks good questions. We're building a mythology here, and mythologies require internal logic." He settled on a crate, pulling out papers. "I've been researching Chester's fictional history. Did you know our dead gambler was supposedly a classical pianist in Chicago before he came west? I didn't either, but that's what the newspapers will print." "You're rewriting his life?" "Improving it. The dead deserve better stories than the living usually get." The judge produced a photograph, not of Chester, but of someone who might have been him from a distance, in bad light if you squinted. "Found this in the courthouse archives. Unknown man from 1885. He's our Chester now." This was how truth died, the tuner thought. Not in grand gestures, but in small revisions, each one reasonable, each one necessary. He'd come to Perdition's Rest to solve a mystery, and found himself instead helping to create one. Sam appeared at the top of the stairs. "We have a problem. There's a reporter coming from the San Francisco Chronicle. He'll be here in 3 days. Wants to investigate our ghost, personally. So let him investigate," Maggie called down. She'd joined them, making this a full gathering of conspirators. "We have our story straight. He's bringing a photographer, and worse, a medium, some woman who claims she can speak to spirits." Silence settled over them like dust. A medium meant theater, meant someone else's performance potentially contradicting their own. The tuner knew how these spiritualists worked. Cold reading, careful observation, lucky guesses presented as otherworldly communication. But they could also expose frauds, having professional interest in eliminating competition. "We need Chester's belongings," the tuner said. "Personal items. The medium will want to hold something of his." "I kept his cards," Sam admitted. "The deck he was playing with that night. Still has." He trailed off, but they all knew what he meant.
Still has bloodstains, though they were actually chicken blood, applied after Chester's theatrical death. "Perfect," Judge Blackwood said. "Nothing says authentic ghost like blood evidence." They spent the afternoon preparing, each taking their role in the elaborate fiction. Maggie would be the grieving landlady who'd lost a good tenant. Sam would play the haunted saloon keeper, guilty about the death that happened in his establishment. The judge would provide legal gravitas, confirming the death certificate and circumstances. And the tuner would be what he was, an outside expert, initially skeptical, but ultimately convinced. That evening, Teddy practiced in the basement while the tuner sat above, listening to both the boys playing and the wind beginning its nightly song through the tunnels. The two sounds were starting to merge, the natural and the artificial becoming indistinguishable. "You knew," Maggie said, joining him at the bar. It wasn't a question. "Knew what? That Chester was alive. You knew before you found him in the mine." The tuner considered his words. "I suspected. The carved animals were too specific, too recent, and the way everyone protected the story. You don't protect a lie that hard unless there's truth underneath it." She poured him whiskey, real whiskey, not Sam's watered version. "My husband died in those mines, 1888. Cave-in took him and 12 others. The company paid nothing, said it was act of God." She sipped her own drink. "Chester being alive in those same mines, it's like something got corrected. Balance restored. That's poetic thinking. That's survival thinking. We tell ourselves stories to make the unbearable bearable." At precisely 2 a.m, Teddy performed. The tuner had shown him how to create the effect, playing his practice keyboard in the basement while the wind carried the sympathetic vibrations up through the shaft, making the actual keys move above. It wasn't perfect, but imperfection added authenticity. Ghosts, after all, shouldn't be too accomplished. The next day, October 12th, brought preparation for the reporter's arrival. Sam cleaned the saloon with unprecedented thoroughness, though he was careful to leave certain atmospheric elements. The bloodstain on the floor, artfully preserved with varnish. The bullet hole in the wall from an unrelated incident, but now part of Chester's story. The piano itself, polished, but not too much, suggesting regular spectral use. "We need a backup plan," the tuner announced during their evening meeting. "If the medium exposes us—" "She won't," Judge Blackwood interrupted. "I've done research of my own. Madame Zelda, she calls herself. Real name, Mary Patterson from Ohio. She's been exposed twice in Denver, once in Salt Lake City. She's as fraudulent as we are." "Then why is she coming?" "Professional courtesy, perhaps. Or she sees opportunity in confirming our ghost, adding her endorsement for a fee." The judge smiled, an expression that made him look younger, despite his 64 years. "Fraud recognizing fraud. There's something almost honest about it." That night, the tuner couldn't sleep. He stood at his window watching the moon silver the desert, thinking about Elizabeth. She would have hated this deception, would have insisted on truth, regardless of consequence. But she'd also never been hungry, never watched a town die around her, never had to choose between honesty and survival. Teddy appeared in the doorway. The boy had taken to shadowing the tuner, learning not just music, but the art of managing truth. "Mr. Piano Man, do you think Mr. Doyle made it to California?" "I hope so." "Me too. He deserved better than dying here, even if he had to die to get it." The boy's logic was becoming as twisted as everyone else's in Perdition's Rest. But what alternative was there? The tuner thought about the piano upstairs, waiting to perform its ghostly concert, and about the living ghosts now hopefully playing real music in a Sacramento music hall. Sometimes, he decided, resurrection required death first, and truth needed lies to protect it. Tomorrow would bring more performance, more careful fiction. But tonight, in the quiet before the desert wind began its song, he could almost believe they were doing something noble. Saving a town, protecting a boy's future, giving a failed gambler a second chance. Almost. The reporter arrived on October 13th with the dust of travel and the sharp eyes of someone who'd exposed enough frauds to expect them everywhere. His name was Harrison Fitzgerald, and he wore his skepticism like armor against the world's tendency toward creative truth. The medium, Madame Zelda, traveled with him, a woman of perhaps 45 years, dressed in purple silk that had seen better decades, carrying herself with the theatrical dignity of someone who'd learned that confidence could substitute for authenticity. The tuner watched from the saloon window as they disembarked from the stagecoach, noting how they surveyed Perdition's Rest with professional assessment. These were people who made their living from other people's beliefs, and they'd come to measure whether this particular belief was worth their endorsement. "Mr. Fitzgerald," Sam greeted them, playing his role of nervous proprietor perfectly. "Madame Zelda, welcome to our humble establishment." "Humble indeed," Fitzgerald replied, his pencil already moving across his notebook. "Population 47, you claim? I count fewer buildings that appear inhabited. Some folks live in the outlying areas," Judge Blackwood interjected, arriving with calculated timing. His sobriety for the occasion gave him an air of authority that even his worn clothes couldn't diminish. "Mining families, mostly. They come to town for supplies and services." The tuner was introduced as the skeptical expert, which required no acting on his part. He genuinely was skeptical of the reporter's intentions, the medium's methods, and the entire enterprise of turning tragedy into tourism. But he played his role, describing his investigation of the piano with technical detail that made Fitzgerald's pencil fly. "Show me the instrument," Madame Zelda commanded, sweeping into the saloon with the certainty of someone who expected reality to arrange itself for her convenience. The piano sat in its corner, afternoon light catching the dust motes that danced above its keys. The medium approached it slowly, her hands extended as if feeling for heat from a fire. It was good theater, the tuner admitted. She knew how to work a room. "I sense profound sadness," she intoned. "A spirit trapped between worlds, bound by unfinished business." "Generic," Fitzgerald muttered, but he wrote it down anyway. The tuner found himself unexpectedly defensive of their ghost. "The phenomenon occurs at 2 a.m, the exact time of Chester Doyle's death." "Chester," Madame Zelda repeated, closing her eyes. "Yes, I feel him. He wants to tell his story." What followed was a séance that would have been comical if the stakes weren't so high. They sat around a table, Sam, the judge, Maggie, the tuner, with Fitzgerald observing and Madame Zelda presiding. Teddy had been banished to the stables, his presence deemed too potentially disruptive to whatever spirits might manifest. "Chester Doyle," the medium called out, "we invite you to commune with us. Give us a sign of your presence." The tuner had to admire Sam's restraint in not immediately providing one.
They waited in theatrical silence while Madame Zelda swayed slightly, humming in a way that suggested otherworldly connection, or possibly indigestion. Then, without warning, a single piano key sounded, B-flat, clear and sustained. Even the tuner jumped, because this wasn't part of their plan. He looked at Sam, who appeared genuinely startled. The wind wasn't right for the natural resonance, and Teddy was in the stables. The note hung in the air like a question nobody wanted to answer. "He's here," Madame Zelda whispered, though she looked as surprised as anyone. Later, the tuner would realize it was Judge Blackwood who'd done it. A piece of wire in his pocket, flicked at just the right moment to strike the piano string from across the room. But in that moment, even the conspirators believed in their own ghost. The séance continued with Madame Zelda channeling Chester's supposed messages. He was sorry for his sins. He played piano to remember better times. He was bound to this place by guilt and music. It was generic enough to be believable, specific enough to seem authentic. Fitzgerald wrote everything down, occasionally asking pointed questions that the medium deflected with practiced ease. "I'll need to observe the 2 o'clock phenomenon," the reporter announced. That night, they all gathered in the saloon. The tuner had coached Teddy extensively. The performance had to be perfect, had to convince not just tourists, but professional skeptics. The boy was in position in the basement. The wind was cooperating, and the moon provided just enough light to make the empty piano visible, but not enough to reveal any mechanical tricks. 1:59. 2 o'clock. The first note came exactly on time, E-flat rising from the piano like a soul ascending. Then B-flat joined it, and then the melody began. Barbara Allen. Slow and mournful, each note weighted with precisely calibrated sorrow. The tuner watched Fitzgerald lean forward, his skepticism warring with the evidence of his senses. The keys moved without hands, the pedals depressed without feet, and the music filled the saloon with ghostly presence. But it was Madame Zelda's reaction that surprised everyone. She began to cry. Not theatrical tears, but genuine emotion, her face crumpling as the song continued. "My daughter," she whispered. "My daughter used to play this." The performance ended with its usual unresolved chord, leaving everyone suspended in that space between belief and doubt. Fitzgerald had stopped writing, his pencil forgotten. Madame Zelda wiped her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had seen better days, like everything else about her carefully constructed persona. "Is it real?" Fitzgerald asked the tuner directly. The tuner considered his answer carefully. "The phenomenon is real. The piano plays without human intervention at precisely 2 o'clock. The explanation, scientific, supernatural, or somewhere between, that's for you to determine." It was the perfect non-answer, confirming nothing while denying nothing. The next morning, October 14th, Fitzgerald and Madame Zelda prepared to leave. The reporter had his story, the medium had her experience, and Perdition's Rest had its validation. But before they boarded the stagecoach, Madame Zelda pulled the tuner aside. "I know," she said simply. His heart stopped. "Know what?" "That sometimes the dead need help from the living to tell their stories." She smiled, an expression that transformed her from mystic to merely human. "My daughter did play Barbara Allen. She died of scarlet fever 10 years ago. That's when I became Madame Zelda.
I wanted to believe I could still reach her. And can you? No, but I can help other people reach their ghosts, real or otherwise. Your ghost here, he serves a purpose. He keeps this town alive, gives that boy in the basement a reason to practice piano, gives all of you a shared secret that binds you together. She patted his arm. Some frogs are more honest than truth. The stagecoach pulled away, taking with it two people who would spread the legend of Perdition's Rest's haunted piano to newspapers and drawing rooms across the country. The tuner stood with the others, watching dust settle in their wake. "Well," Judge Blackwood said, producing his flask and taking a ceremonial sip, "we've done it. We've made Chester more famous dead than he ever was alive." "He'd have liked that," Sam said. And for once, the tuner thought he was probably right. That evening, while Teddy practiced in the basement, not for performance but for the joy of it, the tuner sat at the real piano and played, not Barbara Allen, but something new, something that belonged to the living rather than the dead. The notes filled the saloon with possibility, with the idea that even in a dying town, even built on lies, something beautiful could grow. October 14th faded into evening with the kind of sunset that reminded everyone why they'd once thought this desert was worth inhabiting. Gold and purple painted across endless sky, making even Perdition's Rest look like it belonged in a painting rather than a ledger of failed enterprises. The tuner stood in the saloon, making his final adjustments to the piano, knowing his work here was nearly complete. The town had changed in just 11 days, not visibly. The buildings still leaned with exhaustion. The dust still claimed everything it touched. But in spirit, the investment money had begun to flow. Sam had ordered new glasses for the bar, real ones without chips. Maggie had paid off 3 months of mortgage and bought fresh paint for her boarding house sign. Even Judge Blackwood walked a bit straighter, as if the town's reprieve had granted him one as well. "You're leaving tomorrow," Teddy said. It wasn't a question. The boy had developed a sense for departures, having witnessed too many of them. The tuner nodded, continuing to adjust the piano's action, making sure the keys would respond properly to both human hands and wind-carried vibrations. "My work is finished. The piano is tuned, the ghost is established, and you know enough to maintain both." "But there's still so much I don't know about music." "There's always more to know. That's what makes it worth studying." He handed Teddy a small wrapped package. "Open it after I leave." That evening brought unexpected visitors, 3 families from the outlying claims, drawn by news that Perdition's Rest had a future again. They gathered in the saloon, and for the first time in years, Sam had to actually tend bar rather than just pretend to. The tuner found himself playing requests. Old songs that people half remembered from better times. Melodies that carried memories of places where hope hadn't been a luxury. Judge Blackwood sat beside him on the bench at one point, drunk but dignified. "You know what you've done here, don't you? You've given us permission to survive. Sometimes that's all people need, permission. I tuned a piano, that's all. You tuned a town, my friend. Found our proper frequency and adjusted us until we could resonate again." It was flowery talk from a drunk judge, but the tuner heard truth in it. Every system had its natural frequency, the pitch at which it wanted to vibrate. Push against that frequency and you got discord. Work with it and you got music. Perdition's Rest had been fighting its nature, trying to remain a mining town without mines. Now it was becoming something else. A story, a legend, a place where the impossible happened nightly at 2 in the morning. Near midnight, Maggie pulled him aside. "I've had a letter," she said quietly, "from Sacramento." The tuner's pulse quickened. "Chester?" "He's working at my cousin's music hall, playing piano for silent pictures and vaudeville acts. He's calling himself Charles Delaney now." She smiled. "Apparently he's quite popular. Turns out he plays better when he's not worried about being murdered for debt." It was the best possible news, but it also highlighted the strange arithmetic of their deception. A man had to die to learn how to live. A town had to embrace a lie to find its truth. The tuner wondered what Elizabeth would have made of it all, then decided she would have understood. She'd always said music was about transformation, about taking ordinary air and time and turning them into something that could move souls. At precisely 2 o'clock, they all gathered for what everyone knew would be the tuner's last observation of the phenomenon. Teddy was in position. The wind was perfect, and the piano began its ghostly performance right on schedule. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, Teddy didn't just play Barbara Allen. He played variations on it, subtle changes that suggested growth, evolution, a spirit becoming more comfortable with its haunting. "He's getting stronger," someone whispered. "The ghost is settling in," another agreed. Only the inner circle knew the truth, that Teddy was gaining confidence, adding his own interpretations to Chester's arrangement. The ghost was evolving, because the boy playing it was growing. It was fraud, certainly, but it was also art. When the performance ended, the saloon erupted in applause, not for Teddy, hidden in the basement, but for the ghost himself. Chester Doyle, who'd never received such appreciation while alive, was finally getting his standing ovation. Later, in the empty saloon, the tuner played one last time. He chose Beethoven's Sonata No. 14, the Moonlight Sonata, its first movement perfect for the desert night outside. The notes floated through the room, through the walls, out into the darkness, where they joined the constant whisper of wind through abandoned mine shafts. Teddy emerged from the basement, drawn by the music. "That's beautiful. What's it called?" "It has many names, but I think of it as music for transformations, for times when one thing becomes another." The boy sat beside him on the bench, his young hands tentatively finding the bass notes, playing along with simple harmony. They sat there, the German piano tuner who'd lost his wife and the American orphan who'd lost everything else, making music in a saloon built on dreams and debts. "Mr. Doyle told me once," Teddy said quietly, "that music was the only thing that couldn't lie. Even when people used it for deception, the notes themselves were always honest." He was right. "So our ghost story, it's dishonest, but the music is true?" The tuner considered this. "The story is fiction. The need for the story is true. The music is true. The transformation it enables is true. Truth and lies aren't always opposites. Sometimes they're dance partners, each one leading in turn." Sam appeared in the doorway, unable to sleep, then Maggie, then Judge Blackwood, remarkably sober. They all stood listening as the tuner and Teddy played, their audience of conspirators bound together by shared fiction that had somehow become shared truth. "Play Barbara Allen," Sam requested. "One more time, for Chester, wherever he is." So they did, the tuner providing harmony while Teddy played the melody he'd learned from a dead man who wasn't dead. The notes rose and fell like desert wind, like hope and loss, like all the things people felt but couldn't say.
And somewhere in Sacramento, the tuner imagined, Charles Delaney, formerly Chester Doyle, might pause in whatever he was doing, touched by a feeling he couldn't name, a resonance across miles and time that said he was remembered, even if only by a ghost he'd left behind. The clock on the wall, Sam's prized possession, one of the few things in the saloon that truly worked, ticked toward 3 in the morning. Soon it would be October 15th, the tuner's last day in Perdition's Rest. But for now, in this moment between night and dawn, between truth and fiction, between death and whatever came after, there was only music, honest and pure, filling a saloon in a dying town that had learned how to live again. The stagecoach that would carry the tuner away from Perdition's Rest stood ready in the morning light of October 15th, its horses stamping with the impatience of animals who knew they were headed toward somewhere better. The tuner's bags were loaded, his tool case carefully secured, and yet he lingered on the boarding house porch, watching the town wake up to its new life. Maggie stood beside him, with a package wrapped in brown paper. "Cornbread," she said, "for the journey. It's a long way to anywhere from here." "It always is," he agreed, accepting the gift. They both knew it was more than food. It was acknowledgement of what they'd built together, this elaborate architecture of deception that had somehow become a foundation for truth. Sam emerged from the saloon looking older in daylight, but also somehow lighter, as if releasing Chester's ghost had released something in him as well. "The investors telegraphed this morning," he called out. "They're sending a photographer next month. Want to capture the ghost phenomenon for their promotional materials?" "Teddy can handle it," the tuner said, and Sam nodded. They'd created something sustainable, a mythology that could outlive its creators. The boy himself appeared then, running from the stables with something clutched in his hand. He'd opened the tuner's gift, sheet music, Bach's inventions. Simple enough for a beginner, but complex enough to grow with. "Sir," he said, breathless, "I can't accept this. It must have cost—" "Knowledge doesn't cost," the tuner interrupted. "It pays. Remember that." Judge Blackwood arrived, sober for the morning departure, wearing his best remaining suit, which wasn't saying much. "I've been thinking," he said, which from him was always a dangerous beginning, "about truth and fiction, about the lies we tell to survive and the truths we abandon when they become too heavy." "And what have you concluded?" the tuner asked. "That every town needs its ghost, not just Perdition's Rest, every place where people gather and try to make meaning from accident and ore. We all have our Chester Doyles, our 2 o'clock hauntings, our sounds in the night that might be wind, or might be something more." He pulled out a flask, considered it, then put it away untouched. "You've given us a good ghost. That's no small gift." The stagecoach driver called out, that universal sound of impatience that meant time was burning and miles were waiting. The tuner picked up his remaining bag, but Teddy caught his sleeve. "Will you ever come back? Pianos need regular tuning. Perhaps in a year or 2, Sam will need an expert to maintain the ghost's instrument." It was neither promise nor rejection, but Teddy understood. In the arithmetic of frontier life, perhaps was often the best anyone could offer. As the tuner climbed into the coach, he saw them all gathered, Sam and Maggie, Judge Blackwood and Teddy, even some of the other residents drawn by the gravity of departure. They stood there like a daguerreotype waiting to be taken, a moment preserved in silver and salt and memory. The coach lurched into motion, wheels grinding against dirt that had known so many departures it had worn grooves for them. Through the window, the tuner watched Perdition's Rest shrink into the desert, becoming first small, then distant, then theoretical. But he could still see, or imagined he could see, the saloon where a piano waited for its nightly performance. 5 miles out, the road curved around a massive stone formation that locals called Devil's Pulpit, though it looked more like a piano to the tuner. Upright, solitary, worn by wind into something that might make music if the conditions were right. He thought about Chester, probably in Sacramento now, playing for people who didn't know he was supposed to be dead. About Teddy, who would grow up to be the town's musician, the keeper of its ghost, the guardian of its careful fiction. About Maggie counting her mortgage payments, Sam polishing his new glasses, Judge Blackwood presiding over a town that had argued its way back from death's verdict. The truth was, every place was haunted, not by the dead, but by the living, by their needs and hopes and desperate mathematics. The piano in Sam's saloon would continue to play at 2 a.m, and tourists would come to witness it, and money would flow like water in the desert, rare, precious, possibly illusory, but necessary all the same. And underneath it all, the wind would continue its ancient song through the mine shafts, that natural resonance that had started everything, the earth itself humming at a frequency that human fingers had learned to match. 20 miles out, the stagecoach stopped at a way station to water the horses. The tuner stepped out to stretch his legs and heard, carried on the wind from the direction they'd come, the faintest suggestion of piano notes. It was impossible, of course. The distance was too great, the wind wrong, the whole thing a projection of his imagination. But he heard it anyway. Barbara Allen. Slow and mournful, and somehow hopeful too. The ghost's song following him into whatever came next. He reached into his pocket and found something unexpected. One of Chester's carved animals. A small wooden piano that Maggie must have slipped in when he wasn't watching. He held it up to the light, admiring the craftsmanship, the patience it must have taken to create something so delicate while hiding in a mine shaft, pretending to be dead. Perhaps that was what they'd all been doing. Carving beauty out of desperate circumstances, creating art from survival's raw materials. The ghost of Chester Doyle would live longer than Chester himself ever could have, would play more perfectly, would be mourned more sincerely. It was fraud, certainly, but it was also transformation, the kind of alchemy that turned base metal into gold, or at least into the promise of gold, which, in a place like Perdition's Rest, amounted to the same thing. The stagecoach driver called him back, and the tuner climbed aboard for the rest of his journey to the next town, the next piano, the next mystery that probably wouldn't be a mystery at all, but just people trying to survive with whatever fiction they could craft. He settled into his seat, holding the wooden piano, thinking about resonance, how a string vibrated not just at its fundamental frequency but in harmonics, creating overtones that enriched the sound. Perhaps that's what Perdition's Rest had become. Not just a dying town with a ghost story, but a place resonating with all its possible futures, all its necessary fictions, all its transformed truths. The piano would play at 2 a.m, Teddy would grow into his gift, the town would survive another year, another decade, perhaps even find a way to thrive.
And somewhere in California, Chester Doyle would play for audiences who applauded his skill without knowing they were clapping for a ghost, a man who'd had to die to learn how to live. It was all connected, the tuner realized. The living and the dead, the truth and the fiction, the wind in the mine shafts and the boy in the basement. All of it vibrating at the same frequency, creating a chord that was both dissonant and perfectly resolved. The stagecoach rolled on toward the next town, the next story. But the tuner carried Perdition's Rest with him now, not as a memory, but as a resonance, a frequency he could return to whenever he needed to remember that sometimes the most honest thing you could do was help people maintain their necessary lies. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but behind him, he knew, a piano was waiting for 2 o'clock, for the wind to find its voice, for a ghost that wasn't a ghost to play a song that was entirely true, even though nothing about it was real. The wooden piano in his pocket was smooth from handling, warm from his touch. He wondered if Chester had carved it before or after his death, whether it represented what he'd lost or what he'd found. Perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps all that mattered was that it existed, that beauty had been made from scraps of wood and time and desperate hope. In the distance, mountains rose like questions against the sky, and the tuner closed his eyes, listening with the part of him that heard music in everything, in wagon wheels and wind, in heartbeats and breathing, in the endless percussion of survival against silence. Somewhere, in a saloon in a town that refused to die, a piano waited for its ghost. And the ghost, wherever he was, waited for his resurrection, again and again, night after night, at 2 o'clock in the morning. Forever.